How's the mic sounding? But I don't really need it. Hi everybody, most of you know me, but I am Assistant Professor of English and Irish Studies. My name is Colleen Taylor, and I'm really honored today to be able to introduce and present to you Emma Dabiri, who is one of Ireland's leading public intellectuals. The Flatley Lecture today is sponsored by BC Irish Studies and AATS. Dabiri's 4 books, Don't Touch My Hair, Twisted, Tangled History of Black Hair Culture, What White People Can Do Next, From Allyship to Coalition, which was an international bestseller, and Disobedient Bodies are refreshing in their frank call to action and to education. These literary wake-up calls invite the Irish nation, and indeed the wider Irish diaspora, to broaden its multicultural understanding and relearn what it really means to be Irish. For example, in The Guardian last year, Dabiri wrote that Irish republicanism, from the United Irishman up to James Connolly, has always, quote, rejected ethnicity and blood as the basis for self-determination, meaning Ireland has historically viewed national identity in an inclusivist way. A native Dub, Dabiri was born to an Irish mother and Nigerian father. Her isolating experience as an adolescent in an almost entirely white Dublin fortified the courage that now characterizes her public voice. After studying and teaching African studies in London, she began a broadcasting career on television and the BBC, which led her to professionalize her writing talent. Today, she is a columnist for The Guardian and contributing editor to LUK. But she is best known for her cultural and material history of Black hair in her debut monograph, Don't Touch My Hair, 2019, which she followed with a collection of essays, Twisted, Tangled History of Black Hair Culture, 2020. But the range of her theoretical inquiries is wide, as most recently displayed in her 2023 book, Disobedient Bodies, Reclaim Your Unruly Beauty, a feminist deconstruction of Western Cartesian mind-body dualism that reveals how women have been historically conditioned toward corporeal self-loathing. In resistance to this dominant ideology, the book forwards a philosophy of beauty as action, which I just love that idea. Dabiri is, for me, like an Irish bell hooks, a desperately needed voice for Black feminism and modern post-colonialism and decolonialism in Ireland and abroad. And just like Hooks, her writing is bold and impactful, and as such, it has the power to rupture harmful cultural myths and change the discourse both in the academy and in public. And, like all good Irish writers, her style displays an occasional penchant for humor and satire and sarcasm, so that her writing can both challenge and delight all within the same sentence. Dabiri holds a number of other accolades, but I'll just mention a very brief few. In 2020, she was the Heimbold Chair of Irish Studies at Villanova University. She has presented numerous history, arts, and culture series on TV and radio, including Journeys into Afrofuturism, BBC's Back in Time, and Britain's Lost Masterpieces. Most importantly, she is a fellow in the Royal Society of Literature. And I just want to reiterate how honored we are to have Emma Dabiri here at Boston College. It's a very exciting moment for us, I think, here in Irish Studies. I think she eloquently and profoundly says what most of us academics, including myself, are often too timid to vocalize, and especially in Irish Studies circles. Responding to the Dublin riots in 2023, Dabiri delivered the timely reminder that Ireland too was racialized. She wrote, quote, Ireland's inclusion within the hierarchy of race as white means Irish people can be manipulated emotively to believe that Irishness and whiteness are the same thing. The real story, however, is that Ireland's famine-stricken, violent, and colonized history is, quote, intimately interwoven with today's refugees fleeing the kind of dispossession and injustice Irish people fled in millions in previous centuries. Now, more than ever, at home in Ireland, and here in Irish America too, we need Dabiri's history lessons, her philosophy, and we need her prose, all of which I think we're quite lucky to hear today in her talk, which is titled Becoming Blue, Duine Gorm and Thinking Outside the Taxonomy of Black and White in the Irish Context. Please join me in welcoming Emma Dabiri.
Thank you so much for your very generous introduction. Thank you, everybody. So nice to see you all here on this beautiful, beautiful afternoon. Thank you for coming to listen to me speak. I'm just going to open this because it's shut down. And of course, I've been disconnected from the internet. I'm sure it's not. It's still working. Yes, I haven't been in Boston since 2000, which is an easy calculation for someone who's not great at maths, 25 years ago, which makes me feel absolutely ancient. But yeah, I wanted to open with that actually, because that trip to Boston was in 2000 was really interesting. For me, kind of eye-opening. It was an interesting summer, to say the least. Previously to that summer, I'd spent maybe 5 summers in the States, but I'd been in Atlanta, where so my dad is Nigerian. We moved to Atlanta when I was born in Dublin. We moved to Atlanta pretty much immediately because my dad was studying in Morehouse, which is a historically black college in Atlanta. We moved back to Ireland, but a lot of his family stayed in Atlanta, so I had lots of cousins in Atlanta. I was estranged from my dad for like a long time, but I got back in contact with him when I was a teenager, and then I started going back to Atlanta and hanging out with my cousins there. I got really obsessed with it. So when the summer holidays would come, my white Irish friends, when we hit about 17, everyone started like interrailing. So they would interrail around Europe, and I'd be like, well, I'm not going from Ireland to another homogenous white country where I don't know how comfortable I'll feel, I don't know how safe I'll feel. I'm gonna go to the Black Mecca, I'm gonna go to Atlanta. So while all of my school friends, would be interrailing around Europe, I would be hottailing it to Atlanta, which actually means I missed things like the Berlin Love Parade, and I missed like raving in Ibiza, which is like what they were all doing. But yeah, I was still having a good time in Atlanta. Anyway, come 2020, I decided to come to Ireland on a J1 with a group of white Irish friends and my then boyfriend, who was a white Irish guy. And I had a completely different experience of America. It was the first time, usually when I went to Atlanta, I would end up like extending my stay and just like staying for like an extra kind of couple of weeks. I'd really just staying as long as I possibly could. That summer that I came to Boston, and it wasn't just Boston, I also went to places that I don't think many Black people really go, but Ocean City in Maryland, which is like where like Irish students go there to like work in bars. And I worked in a saloon called the Purple Moose Saloon, and people used to come in to see the Black Irish girl because they couldn't believe that such a thing existed. But yeah, that was the first summer that I actually went back to Ireland early. I was like, not actually having that much fun. And it was really eye-opening actually. So at home in Ireland, I had different experiences to my friends who were essentially all white. I had different experiential reality. But I felt like coming to Boston, kind of white New York and Maryland, those differences that at home were just kind of experiential, here felt more like codified and spatial. And I actually felt like I was in spaces that I wasn't supposed to be in, and that I didn't feel welcome in, and that my presence in seemed to challenge, I felt often, particularly with Irish Americans, their concept of what Irishness was or could look like. So I felt, a degree of discomfort. I have to say, I'm now on my second trip back in a very different capacity, in a very different world. I feel no discomfort being here in Boston. It's very lovely. I'm having a really nice time. But I did just want to, I wrote about that summer in what white people could do next. So because this is my next time back in the city, I did want to reference it. So, when I was growing up, I had this, it was quite a profound experience of kind of like disassociation in many ways, in that I felt like I wasn't supposed to exist, that my existence was in some way like an aberration or some sort of, I'm using strong language, but this is really how it felt, like some sort of an abomination. And there is a long history of people who are mixed, of African and European ancestry, being positioned as being an affront to the natural order of things. A history that kind of goes back to the 1600s, in the 17th century. And it's interesting that mixedness is seen as an affront to the natural order of things, because the system that it's perceived as deviating from is this hierarchy of race, which is itself a 17th century, well, race in terms of there being a white race and a black race, is an invention, is an English colonial invention from the 17th century. So it's far from being the natural order of things. It's a very specific ideological construction, which I'm going to get into a little bit more as the talk goes on. But this was the feeling that I had, I guess, growing up in Ireland and being Black and Irish. There was a sense that this was, actually let me not skip ahead. So this was, this idea of mixed people as being an affront to the natural order of things is something that has its roots in kind of the English colonies of the Caribbean and what would become the United States in the 17th century. But then in Europe more recently, there were similar ideas, with in Germany, where there was a small group of mixed people of Afro-Germans who were called, known as the Rhineland Bastards, who were seen as degenerates, who were a contamination to the German race, and who were forcibly sterilized, who were seen as, they were deemed hereditarily unfit. And while there was no kind of policy like that in Ireland, there was a sense that, that my existence was something that, shouldn't be. There was something, unnatural, as it were. The concept of being a Black Irish person, that was just a contradiction. These two things were seen as being mutually exclusive. I'm talking about the 1980s and the early 1990s. There's been really interesting developments since this point in time, which I will move on to. But this was certainly the kind of like operating logic when I was growing up. I feel like my overall response to this was to just very wholesalely claim the blackness that I was perceived as being, and then with an increasing antipathy towards and ultimate rejection of the Irishness that projected me. It was interesting as well, I knew a handful of other mixed people, and there were varying responses to what we were experiencing. But I think whereas my response was to very much kind of reject Irishness, and I think another more typical response that I saw was to try and prove how Irish one was as an attempt to fit in and belong, but that doesn't suit my kind of character or personality type. So that was not the kind of approach that I took. But that was not without costs and consequences, again, which I will kind of elaborate on over the course of this conversation. I felt a really strong affinity to Black American history and culture. I think because of those early days in Atlanta, which I definitely romanticized and kind of I think looked at through slightly rose-tinted spectacles. But I essentially had a happy few years there where I never thought about race. I didn't think about blackness or whiteness. And then the contrast between that experience and moving back to and also I lived in a very sunny, salubrious suburb. And then we moved from there back to a very impoverished part of Dublin, which was not sunny or salubrious, and which was in many ways kind of hostile. So I think that the that contrast gave me this kind of very romanticized kind of memory of Atlanta. I also felt that Black Americans were, like me, people of African descent who were not in Africa and who were Western in the way that I was. But also I was aware that many people, the Black American population was actually a multiracial population, and it was comprised of people who had similar ancestry to me, who were West African, and European, and often that European ancestry was Irish. So I think on that level, I also felt an affinity. And I really, really wanted to be American. I think like this was also to do just with, like popular culture and the kind of like the status that was associated. I think like with being American, particularly like in Ireland, I guess in that time it seemed very glamorous. So I knew that when I finished, I decided that when I finished school, I would leave Ireland. I would get out of there as soon as possible. And I wanted to go to Atlanta, but that didn't end up happening, and I moved to London to study African studies at SOAS. And I'm actually really glad that that happened, everything for a reason, even though at the time I was devastated. But one of the things that happened in moving to the UK was, I guess, me coming to this realization, having to confront, I guess, my own Irishness, which I hadn't really like understood, I think, until I lived in the UK, which is where I discovered that there were so many things about me that I thought were just like, idiosyncrasies of Emma, that I realized were very culturally specifically Irish things. So much of my perspective of the world, my sense of humor, the lens through which I made sense of things was rooted in my Irishness. And that was like quite a difficult thing for me to reconcile. But I think I came to understand that irrespective of what anybody told me I was or I wasn't, that I was Irish, and this was something that I was going to have to, I guess, make peace with and try and, I guess, like reconcile, and also reconcile that notion of being Black and Irish, which was, this is still in the 90s, this is like 98, which was still something that was seen as being, I think, mutually unintelligible, and this kind of idea that you would have to choose between the two, and not even that you could fully choose Irishness because that was, kind of synonymous with whiteness. So this was kind of like a personal, I guess, identity stuff that I was grappling with. But also while studying at SOAS, so my first degree was in African studies. But studying African studies and post-colonial studies and language and the role of language in Africa and what had happened in Africa with the imposition of European languages. Again, I was confronted just with the profound similarities between much of that history and what had happened in and to Ireland. And I couldn't help but draw these parallels. And I guess that gave me, that just kind of reignited my interest, I guess, in the Irish language and in Ireland as a post-colonial nation. I had always loved, it was interesting that I felt that I had to reject Irishness because I'd always been obsessed with Irish folklore and mythology. And I ended up, as I said, going to study African studies, but I think if there hadn't been the experiences of not belonging and racism that I experienced, I probably wouldn't have done African studies. I probably would have stayed in Ireland and studied Irish mythology or Irish folklore or something, because I was very passionate about that from a young age. But happily, I've been able to like integrate that into my work more recently. So 10 years ago now, on the centenary, not 10 years ago, 9 years ago, the centenary of the Easter Rising, I wrote a piece, I wrote an article in The Guardian called "I'm Irish, but I'm not white. Why is that still a problem as we celebrate the Easter Rising?" I wrote it for The Guardian. I didn't expect it to be published in Ireland or really to have any impact in Ireland. And then I found out that the Irish Times wanted to syndicate it and to publish it, and they wanted to publish it as well. And I was like, great. And I was anticipating a certain response from the Irish public, and I got a very different response, which I will come to in a moment. So in that article, I write about my kind of like formative years in Atlanta and living there with an Irish mother and Nigerian father, but my dad is out studying ostensibly. I'm at home. I'm at home with my mom in the house, and one of the things that we did together, and that I have very, I don't know if I have actual memories of these things because I was like 4, but I still remember all the words and all the lyrics. So learning all of these songs and poems that my mum taught me while we were living there had really kind of shaped my consciousness. So my mum taught me just like a lot of trad, like a lot of traditional songs and a lot of kind of like revolutionary poetry. So I feel like this early immersion in that kind of material shaped the kind of anti-imperialist lens that has, I guess, informed all of my work, irrespective of, if I've been looking more at Africa, if I've been looking more at Irishness, and also able to identify the continuities, between kind of like blackness and Irishness. But so, yeah, in those early years, I was immersed in these tales of heroic Irish men, actually, to be fair, there weren't many women featured. And I particularly remember the song James Connolly. There's lots of different versions of it, but the one that my mom would play, well, we would sing it actually, but the one that the recorded version I remember most clearly is Christy Moore's one. I think it's Christy Moore with Planksty. So I remember kind of being obsessed with this imagery of Connolly, who was, he'd been shot and he's bleeding profusely from his wounds, and he's unable to walk, but he's carried to the firing range by the British soldiers and shot nonetheless. This image had a really like strong impact on me. We went back to Ireland soon after that, and my head was definitely full of all of these like, heroic stories and these like myths and legends and Irish heroes. And then we got back, and pretty quickly I got called the N-word. And I was like, oh, okay. So that kind of like, yeah, I guess that was there was a disconnect between, I guess, what I had anticipated or imagined, and then my reality being there. And I would say that experience kind of began what I would say was like kind of an obsession with my race. Not an obsession that I have, an obsession that the environment around me seemed to have, and that kind of set the parameters of my life. So the black one, the dark one, these were the politer epithets, but polite or not, and often not. It was constant. My race seemed to be the first port of call in everybody's perception, in everybody's perception of me. And growing up in Ireland, me growing up in Ireland at that time, was really characterized by covert racism, often overt racism, isolation, bullying, and a lot of stigmatization. I find it very interesting because my Nigerian grandfather moved to Ireland in the 1940s to study at Trinity. He went back to Nigeria. But his experience there and my father's as a young child, because he did some schooling in Ireland, was extremely different to mine. And I want to focus on that for a moment because I think this suggests something very interesting about race and Irishness. So my grandfather was a high court judge in Nigeria, but he studied law he moved to Edinburgh, found Edinburgh actually, he wasn't having a good time in Edinburgh, experiencing racism, and there were no Nigerians. He heard that there was like actually a kind of popping like Nigerian student community in Dublin, which is like not something I had been familiar with. But yeah, there was actually quite a small cohort of Nigerian students in Trinity and in the Royal College of Surgeons. So he moved to Dublin with my grandmother, and they were there for some years because my dad's siblings were all born in Ireland. My dad was actually born in Nigeria, but his siblings were born in Ireland, and he did some years of schooling in Dublin. And they were going back to Nigeria They were, I guess, like international students who I don't think posed any, they were always going back, they weren't immigrants, and I don't think they weren't claiming to be Irish. I don't think they were like troubling anyone's notions of Irishness. And their experiences, they spoke very glowingly of those years in Ireland, to the point where when my dad came to go to university himself, he came back to Ireland because his dad had had such a good time, and because his childhood memories were fond. That couldn't be more at odds with the experience that I had. And I really think, in large part, that was because of what I said a few moments ago about them being temporary visitors who were leaving. I think specifically for me, many of the problems arose out of my claims to Irishness itself. As I said, I eventually rejected this, but I think initially I was just people would, of course I was constantly asked where I was from. I would always be like, I'm from here, because I have nowhere else to say. And then I think it was that, and also the fact of me just essentially culturally being, completely Irish. I think this is what seemed to offend people's sensibilities. Irish at that time was synonymous with whiteness. Whiteness, as it was constructed as a racial category, was quote unquote pure and didn't extend to brown girls, brown people, or anybody who wasn't white. Even those that could trace their ancestry in Ireland back to the 10th century, which I can do, probably earlier, but at least till then. But despite this, I frequently heard that I wasn't really Irish. And this was just, it was frustrating, because not only was I born there, but in addition to that, as I said, my mother, her parents, their parents, for generations, they're all Irish. So what was the thing? And also I had friends who had one non-Irish parent, but that non-Irish parent was white, so these people were white, and their Irishness was never questioned. So this denial of Irishness was intimately, explicitly connected to the fact that I am of African descent. So in that article, I asked, did those revolutionary men like James Connolly, who caught my imagination from such a young age, and also Roger Casement, another Irish nationalist and humanitarian activist, also executed in 1916. I was like, did those people not fight for my liberation too? And the Ireland that I returned to and had those experiences in seemed like a far cry from the Ireland that I had been introduced to through the history, songs, and poetry that my mother had taught me. I would say writing that essay and it being published in Ireland had marked a significant milestone in my relationship to Ireland and in my rehabilitation to my relationship to Ireland. I had expected, at that time I was writing quite a lot about race in the English press, and also had quite a few pretty high profile television interviews and debates, and the backlash against them was absolutely wild. And I had expected very much like, well, if you don't like it, you can get out of our country kind of thing. And I had expected a similar kind of response when this article was published in Ireland. I couldn't have been more wrong. I actually experienced a huge outpouring of support from white Irish people who were just like, I can't believe that's what you experienced. I'm not saying you didn't experience it, not trying to deny that it happened, but just being really, really kind and supportive in a way I just hadn't anticipated, because it didn't bear much resemblance to what I had experienced growing up. And also people just being like, I'm so ashamed. In my second book, What People Can Do Next, I talk about how shame is not a generative, kind of emotion to work from, and how trying to kind of guilt or shame people into doing better is not a generative or effective strategy. So people feeling ashamed is not something that I would encourage at all. But nonetheless, I was touched and surprised by, of course there were some exceptions to this sentiment, but for the most part, it was incredibly supportive. Another thing that I was completely flabbergasted by, because bearing in mind I've been out of the country for a long time at this stage, was the amount of young Black Irish people that there now were, which I hadn't really known about, and I became aware of in large part through this essay, because I had so many reach out to me on social media, and I was just like, oh my goodness, there's a whole like kind of new demographic that just didn't exist. When I was a child or a teenager, because I left when I was still a teenager. But around the time I left, which was the late 90s, was the same period that there actually started to be more immigration into Ireland from Africa and Asia. And also the sizable Brazilian community that's there now, which is so interesting to me, because whenever I go home now, everyone just thinks now I make sense in Dublin, but everyone just thinks I'm Brazilian. And so I have people like speaking to me in Portuguese, Brazilian people speak to me in Portuguese, I have like white Irish people speaking in Portuguese, I'm like, I cannot know a word of Portuguese, I'm like literally like from Dublin, I'm literally from Rialto. But I find that really interesting. But so a lot of those people that had started migrating in the kind of mid to late 90s, their children were now like coming of age and constituted this generation of people who were Black and Irish. Also, I think when I was growing up, like I said, I was pretty much an anomaly, but there was like a handful of us. But we pretty much all, I think without exception, had Irish moms and African fathers. Whereas with the because it was mainly the children of African students who were mostly male. Not many women, not many Black women had moved to Ireland at that. Not many Black women, period, had moved to Ireland, but there were very few women. And now with this migration in the mid to late 90s that started happening, it was less international students and people that were actually like moving there to live. And there was more gender balance as well. So not everybody was mixed, with an Irish mom. But anyway, that essay, I guess, just kind of put me on the radar of a lot of the kind of like black and brown Irish community, which the term New Irish was being used. I don't know what people think of that, or if many people self-identify as that. I started being described as New Irish, and I was just like, no, there's nothing New Irish like about me. I don't want to. Yeah, I guess for other people, you have a different migration story to Ireland. I actually don't know how popular that term is, but anyway, this term started to be used. It's one that personally, to describe me, I reject. But anyway, I started just kind of spending a lot more time in Ireland, and the work that I was doing around processes of racialization, identity, post-colonial studies that I was doing in the UK, I started kind of just doing more of that in Ireland, and I was really fascinated by the developments that were happening there, emergent discourses, cultural expressions, and contestations. So I watched with interest the developments around the Irish language that were happening in kind of, the Irish language specifically, that were happening in 2021. I saw online something that was happening where a group of kind of young Black Irish speakers were rejecting the term Duine Gorm, I think it's up there, which is the kind of the theme of this talk. So Duine Gorm is the blue people. And this was the term that had been used to describe people who we would racialize as Black in that kind of like architecture of race that we've inherited from the period of the transatlantic slave trade. But in Irish, somebody wouldn't be described as Duine Dubh, a Black person, for various reasons. But one of them being that, when capitalized, Duine Dubh is the devil, but also because of the negative connotations with the colour black, a person wouldn't be described as a black person. That was very interesting to me, because when we start to see the idea of there being a black race that exists, which is introduced in colonial Barbados through the set of slave codes in 1666, one of the reasons that this idea is introduced and becomes like codified into law, of there being races with like immutable differences between them and different rights under the law. One of the reasons that black is actually used is because of the negative connotations with the colour. So this is the beginning of a process of dehumanization of people of African descent, whereby the economies of these early English colonies are becoming increasingly reliant on stolen labour from the African continent. And in order to justify the exploitation of that labour, this kind of process of dehumanization is necessary to put forth the argument, well, these people aren't fully human, we're actually doing them a favour by bringing them to civilization, by introducing them to Christianity. And because of the negative connotations with the colour black and the positive connotations with the colour white, this is part of the logic that's actually informing the use of those terms. So the fact that in the Irish language it was understood that black had negative connotations and thus you wouldn't call a person, you wouldn't describe a person as black, I found very interesting. At the time there was a Guardian article written that was called the title was Blue No Longer, Person of Colour has been added to the Irish lexicon. So I had heard Duine Gorm growing up, and I knew it meant blue people, but to be honest, I hadn't really given much thought to it. I just saw some weird arcane quirk in a subject that I hated, and I really did hate studying the Irish language when I was in school, as I think probably the majority of people who went to school in Ireland did. And it was very much taught as a subject, and something that was a subject rather than like a living embodiment of a whole kind of alternative worldview. And I remember, like, if I was in trouble, which I was frequently, I'd have to write lines. I'd have to write the lines in Irish. So this association of the language with punishment. Also, if you had to go to the toilet, so we spoke English in school, but if you had to go to the toilet with me, you had to ask in Irish, or you weren't allowed to go to the toilet. And you know that everyone knows the sentence. So yeah. So if you couldn't ask in Irish, you couldn't go. So there was just there was this kind of fear and shame and punishment, associated with the language. So I had heard Duine Gorm, but I was pretty I didn't really give it much thought. Being reintroduced to the idea in this period, though, where I had really started to kind of reimagine my relationship to the Irish language. I think by this time I had started going back to the Gaeilge talks and trying to relearn Irish, which is an ongoing side project of mine. I was excited actually by the decolonial possibilities that existed in a way of describing people that predated the invention of the racial categories black and white. And I thought that rather than just, actually I'm going a little bit off, let me just read from here. So I Googled this recently, and I wouldn't take the AI overview as a cited reference, but I want to read it because I know it's what a lot of people go to will go to kind of get their information on something. And the AI overview of all of this says, in the Irish language, the term Duine Gorm, literally blue people, was historically used to refer to people of colour, specifically black people. While this term has been in use for generations, it is now being replaced by the more accurate and less offensive term, Duine Dada, person of colour. And I was like, sorry, why is that more accurate and less offensive? To who? Who's decided that? I personally don't use the language person. I don't use the term person of colour. I think it's replete with problems. So the idea that this kind of cut and paste of a term that makes more sense here into the Irish context, when there's a term that could be explored for its decolonial possibilities, I found frustrating, to say the least, or I thought it showed something of like a lack of willingness or a lack of imagination, which I will expand on in a moment. So the Guardian article says that the Irish language has long wrestled with the description of people who are not white. It says that Fear-Dove could refer to a man of any colour with black hair or black skin, and when capitalised, it refers to the devil. For generations, Irish speakers used an odd alternative, Duine Gorm, to indicate people who were not white. Others used Duine Deutsche, coloured person. One version evokes creatures from the film Avatar. The other echoes language associated with apartheid South Africa. And then the chief terminologist at Forest and Gaeilge, the public body that promotes Irish in the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland actually, he said, we're happy to use this new terminology. It's a case of concepts emerging and changing. We're happy to use Duine Dada, person of colour, instead of Duine Gorm. I strongly disagreed. In fact, what I see here is a literal translation of Irish, not only the language, but actually the ontology that exists within the Irish language, as being, actually just disregarded. And it's I see the shutting down of possibility for the exploration of a world that is not circumscribed by the parameters of colonial logic. So to me, that doesn't really seem like a win, but it kind of seems like a tragedy, and again, like an expression, like a profound lack of imagination. A big motivation in me writing the book that I wrote in 2021 was the fact, which is what white people can do next, was I felt that there was a historic opportunity to reconfigure attitudes and reignite imaginations that was actually being squandered by an anti-racist narrative that inadvertently reinforced much of what it claimed to want to overcome. And I was really disappointed in what I saw as a reaffirmation of the commitment to racialized thinking. So according to this logic of this type of anti-racism, kind of a liberal anti-racism, yes, racism is bad, it asserts, but the conversation is framed as though there are available outcomes other than racism when one assumed race as a foundational truth. So what I was seeing very much happening in that moment post 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and the kind of booming anti-racist industry that emerged was this probably unconscious but nonetheless strong tendency to double down on the racial categories black and white, to make blanket statements about the behaviours, beliefs, actions and desires of diverse groups of people unified under these fictive generic racial categories. And really it highlighted to me how many of us still apparently believed that race does exist as a natural biological reality. And I had serious reservations about that social movement. And we can actually see now as we kind of like stand in the chaos and the I guess the detritus of it, that it wasn't effective. I wrote that book because I could see that it was not going to be effective. So I wrote at the time, I have serious reservations about popular social movements, however well-intentioned, that reinforce a reinvestment of racial categories in this way. So in that period, I had never seen such a widespread identification of whiteness, white people, this, that, and the other. But it didn't seem to be accompanied by any necessary understanding of the fictitiousness of the category of white. Unless the idea of whiteness as a natural category is disrupted and replaced with something else, the underpinning belief in the superiority that is enshrined as natural to that category will remain intact. And I wrote at the time, we'll end up back here over and over again, with the best that we can hope for is continued petitioning to the kindness of charitable white people who might advocate for those of us who are deemed less fortunate. And again, from the book, I wrote, doubling down on the sanctity of racialized categories is far from radical, although its proponents, including many who identify as anti-racist, remain enamored with doing so. But investment in the absoluteness of racial categories is in fact a conservative, fearful choice. What would be truly radical would be to sound the death knell for the fiction that white people constitute a race, and that this race is imbued with natural abilities unavailable to others. The first step in this would be the mainstreaming of knowledge about the invention of race. So when I started learning about the invention of whiteness myself, something that really intrigued me was the question of who white people were before they were white. Because of course there have always been people that have different complexions and that have different phenotypes, that have different features, that have different hair textures. But the idea that those things have any like intrinsic meaning or can be used to assume the characteristics, abilities, or lack of abilities of people is something that is an idea that is introduced in the invention of the idea of a white race and a black race, which we see the kind of first evidence of in colonial Barbados. I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in one moment. I'm also, sorry, I'm just thinking how long I've been speaking. Actually,
So 50 minutes.
50, yeah, okay. I'm going to stop soon. Okay, so, God, I timed this like, it was so, okay, sorry, this is a lot. But we can, please ask questions and we can talk more afterwards as well. Okay, so when I started learning, so yeah, who white people were before they were white. And we hear so much about the gains that people who became racialized, let me actually speak about the Irish, specifically in the Irish in America. We hear so much about the gains in terms of material privileges and power that were accessed through becoming racialized as white. But I was also really keen to explore what might have been lost. I feel that so much of the work that I do and so much of these ideas are actually increasingly rooted in our relationship with the land and our relationship with the natural world. And one of the things that I find like so inspiring about the Irish language is its the way it locates the human in a very different and far more kind of symbiotic relationship, like with the land. So last weekend I was hiking in Kerry and was walking along the Kerry Way, and I actually just felt so deep. It was also like the weather was like this, which is like unheard of. It was just like glorious hot sunshine, like unbroken for like 3 days. I felt deeply energized by the land, but also attuned to how much suffering and despair it had absorbed. We went to look at the ruins of, sorry, I'm a little distracted. Would you mind closing the door? Yeah. It might be a bit quieter, sorry. I wasn't even saying to shush them. I was like, close the door because I think it was open a little bit. Thank you. Yeah, we went to visit the ruins of some of the famine houses that had been abandoned during Wartime War, the Great Hunger. And I was there most of the group I was with were American and some British people. I think I was only one of 2 Irish people. I actually think maybe some of them were like, why is this black girl like so, you know, into like moved by this history. But yeah, I'm sitting there in the ruins of one of the houses, and it felt like very charged, very powerful. I felt like very, very, very moved by it. I feel like repairing our disconnect from the natural world, is key to liberation movements. But recently, I've been hearing more and more people identify the importance of healing processes, not just for ourselves, but also for the land itself. So I'm just trying to condense a lot of stuff. So I had complicated feelings being here, though, in that I was aware. So I'm just trying to. So I found visiting these places like profoundly moving, but then I also felt complicated and a whole lot of conflicting emotions. My own family, on my Irish side, obviously comes from Kilshamall, which is in County Mayo, and it's somewhere that was decimated by the famine, and one of the places that many people left. But my grandfather, who comes from there, he went to Cambridge in the 1940s, and he became a civil servant in the colonial administration in Trinidad. Well, actually in a few different British colonies, but the place where he was for the longest was Trinidad. And he was actually a white supremacist, so not just casually racist, but actually somebody with a deep investment in the idea of the racial superiority of white people. So needless to say, he was unimpressed by my birth, or by my parents' marriage. I found myself grappling with the fact that, I guess the actual intergenerational trauma that I've inherited from what happened in this part of Ireland and the experiences that people had. But then, this sense of just being deeply troubled by many of the people that left these parts of Ireland came to the States, and their treatment of the Black Americans that they encountered is something that I just find it extremely difficult to contend with. Not to mention the fact that it feels like a macrocosm of what I experienced growing up. So I'm actually just going to read one more little bit and then stop because it's been going on for too long. And then there's more I'd like to talk about, but perhaps that will come up in the questions. Okay, so I've long been interested in the intersection between Irishness and whiteness. And we hear a lot about how the Irish in America enthusiastically embraced the project of white supremacy in order to distinguish themselves from Black Americans, who they often had quite a lot in common with culturally, in terms of not just a shared history of oppression either. Kind of frustrates me when people say there's similarities between Black people and Irish people just because of the shared history of oppression. It's also deeper than that. I think it also exists in the oral nature of our cultures, in the storytelling, in the centrality of, of song, of mythology. There's a lot of overlap outside of the shared history of oppression. But in order to distinguish themselves from Black Americans, there was often this investment in the project of white supremacy. And I think when I first heard about the draft riots, when Irish Americans had gone through Manhattan lynching Black Americans, it's one of the reasons that there was actually a big exodus of Black people out of Manhattan into Brooklyn. I don't know, just things that I try to process. I'm just skipping ahead. Okay, so thinking about the psychological imperatives of an investment in whiteness. David Rodiger, who is a Labour historian, has a fascinating thesis that the imperative driving Irish workers to define themselves as white, despite their hatred of the British and often a distaste for their American descendants, was a public and psychological wage that whiteness promised to desperate immigrants in an industrializing society that held them in contempt. millions of Irish forced to come to America during Gorton War between 1845 and 1855 helped seal the later marriage between the Democratic Party and Irish Catholics, who brought in thousands upon thousands of largely urban voters and used their political strength to buy acceptance as white. Yet Rodiger cautions against seeing the embrace of whiteness in purely utilitarian terms. He argues that for Irish American Catholics, the anxieties and the desires resulting from a loss of relationship with nature were particularly acute. He argues, or he explains, that though gang labour, cottage industry, and putting out systems had substantial currency in mid-century Ireland, he argues that no antebellum European immigrant group experienced the wrenching move from the pre-industrial countryside to full confrontation. Oh. Sorry, it just disappeared. I'm just wrapping up now. No other European immigrant group experienced the wrenching move from the pre-industrial countryside to full confrontation with industrial capitalism in an urban setting with anything like the intensity of Irish Catholics. He says, and I quote, "Torn from their homes, they resettled in places remarkably different from Ireland, not only relocated in cities, but in the most crowded quarters of them. Irish Americans maintained only the most tenuous of ties to nature. In part, the Irish immigrants' anguish over the divorce from the rhythms of nature and the land were covered over by their attacking pre-industrial behaviours as black. And the more frantically they sought to distance themselves from black people, the more apparent became the mixture of fascination and repulsion. Most of them, too, were Irish speakers. And what did it mean for them to reimagine the world in the English language?" And I'm going to skip a whole lot and just go to the conclusion. Okay, so Duine Gorm, which, let me show you the blue that I'm referring to. Okay. So there's much debate about what the blue in Duine Gorm refers to in reference to the people that we now racialise as black. The first reference to it is as early as AD 867 from the Fragmentary Annals of Ireland. And there's also references to Duine Gorm in Tig O'Kianan's diary, The Flight of the Earls, which covers the period from 1607 to 1608. There's a long stretch of history where we see references to this idea of Duine Gorm and a familiarity with people who would now be racialised as black. The blue in question is not the primary colour blue, but actually refers to something far more poetic. The interpretation that I like the most of it, there's various ones, but is that it's the iridescence that shows when light shines on a dark surface. For instance, the dancing, shimmering effect when bright sunlight shines on a dark sea. I'm really excited by the decolonial possibilities of thinking about difference outside of the violent taxonomy of race, and the way this understanding is oriented towards a relationship with the natural world, and the necessity of sunlight to make sense of this term. The Irish Sudanese scholar Sarah Babaker has written about this linguistic expression as well. And in addition to writing about Duine Gorm, she's also examined the phrase white person, oscuelga. She writes, "Of course the term white people became popularized, but I found that modern dictionaries still preserve some of Irish's metaphysical connotations. Bon is typically used for white, but here, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this properly, but here Gala is used. Is used, which can mean white or bright. Galon, its verb, is used to describe the shining of the sun, while a derivative galok means the moon. So this word is associated with both the moon and the sun. The word for people that would be racialised as white, but not called white in Irish. And Duine Gorm, the iridescence caused by light shining on dark as the sun hitting the sea. And it also always reminds me of the pathway to Tiernan. If anyone wants to talk about multiverses in quantum physics, I wanted to get into that, but there's no time. We can talk about that. Okay, for me, the fact that these terms have their logic and origin in the body's entanglement with the natural world rather than an origin and logic rooted in the economics of the transatlantic slave trade, is hugely inspiring, and it offers profound possibilities for the ways in which things were and once can be again different. Why do Irish people need what is essentially a violent British colonial concept to understand or make sense of our identities? What might a more decolonial Irish worldview offer? Indeed, what alternatives might already exist in the Irish language? I see Ireland as uniquely situated to tackle all of this and to come up with specific responses and set examples that others can follow. As I got older, I became more insistent on claiming the Irishness that many had tried to deny me. Not because I was trying to be something I'm not, but because I could only make sense of myself if I recognised who I am in my entirety. So in my research now, I'm exploring ecology more. I'm really excited about continuing to think about the insights for reimagining our relationship to the natural world through the Irish language, and merging that with similar explorations in Yourba. And then thinking about how these linguistic and ontological worlds met in the Caribbean, which is something I'm researching at the moment, and the ways these knowledge systems, suppressed if not destroyed by the forces of imperialism, can now help us think creatively about solutions to the various crises that have been created by living in a world designed according to colonial logic. Oh, yeah, that's the end.
Before we get into questions, I just want to let everyone know that there's a reception in Connolly House after we finish our questions. Set up, sponsored by the Concepts. Thank you very much. Please join us there. But we have time for questions.
Sorry for the abrupt ending. I was going to do more, but no, I have to stop.
Woman back.
Hi. Hi. Really, really interesting talk. I recently read David Berger's work.
Awesome.
Yeah, very interesting. And I kind of was wondering if this way that we're kind of so used to the essentially naturalization of race, like how do you think the 2020s are different from when like Barbara Field was writing her work on the fact that all race is constructed against blackness? Like, are we in a different moment now, and can we essentially find a way to take the work of scholars writing about the way that race is essentially completely constructed? Like, how do we bring that to the masses, essentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I thought the time when there was so much attention, focused on racism and anti-racism after the murder of George Floyd, I was like, if ever there's time to mainstream this information, it's now, which is why I wrote the book that I wrote. But I don't know. It's like I feel like that was a moment. I will keep plugging away at it. I'm not the only one, but it is up against something that has had close to 500 years, an idea that has had close to 500 years to embed itself as a foundational truth, and one that many people, because when you look at somebody and see difference, and because that has been explained through the lens of race, it's quite hard to divest people, I feel, from their investment in that. I honestly, I don't know the answer. I think it would be really interesting, because obviously this is an example from Ireland, but I imagine that, so whiteness is an amalgamation, and it was an idea, the idea that there being this white race, you have the colonial Caribbean, where there are let me think about Barbados, because that's where we see it first. You've English planters, Scottish planters, you have indentured Irish, many who've been sent there by Cromwell, and then you have kidnapped Africans. Chattel slavery hasn't actually been legalized yet. That's going to happen with these slave codes that introduce the idea of kind of Negro race, quote unquote. But the fact that in Irish, in the Irish language, people didn't use the racialized term white or the racialized term black, and that exists in Irish, that must exist for other people who are racialized as white as well. So I assume. So I feel like rather than just like cut and pasting the logic of race invented in the transatlantic slave period, like rather than just using that by default, it would be interesting if there was more research to encourage people to look at what other, possibilities already exist, and what other ways we have already in existence of thinking about difference. That's actually what my PhD is about. But in terms of mainstreaming it, I don't know. Like I wrote what white people can do next in a very accessible way, so that those ideas would be accessible in a mainstream way. But still, I mean, yeah.
Thank you, that was wonderful.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm curious about the part of your talk you skipped with language, so perhaps my question might connect to it a bit. So I really love that you're thinking about the Irish language that way, and land, and whatever ethos. I like that term. I'm wondering what you think in terms of the Irish language and in other languages that have that same capability.
Mm-hmm.
And these could be, there are so many languages that have been lost that are in states of permutation of use, so it's hard for me to point to one thing, but this doesn't, this is not central to Europe, just so many during the colonial period and even now.
Yeah.
So where do you see the connection between how a word like Duine Gorm and how that creates something in a space, right, that's different, and then our encounter with the space itself, like, or how you were out in Kerry hiking, and then like where that exists, the place between the word and what it can do in our conceptualization or as a sign, and the space of being, what that does in terms of like a somatic sense. Like for you, having the word and then having the space, where do they meet? Perhaps that's strange, but I'm curious about that localizing, because it seems to be like a place where there's more possibility, and perhaps it taps into something beyond our thinking mind in racial terms, and maybe that is a pathway somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah. Is that a question or just like
No,
a statement?
I want to know what you think. I want to know what you were going to say.
Yeah, I don't know that I was gonna say that I was gonna expand on that specifically, but I'm happy to try and think through it and attempt to answer. How does it sit with me? I feel I'm not going to start describing myself as a blue person. Like that's not necessarily what I'm saying. I am just excited that there are people, and especially what I was saying in the talk was like in that kind of great racial reckoning post 2020. There was just this kind of doubling down on and reinvestment in the racial categories that we have, and it seems like often people just can't think outside of or beyond them. So I feel that like the existence of something like this just excites me and makes me want to research further. I feel like I need to be able to speak Irish. I need a greater depth of understanding of the Irish language to understand the possibilities that exist there. I also feel like in, one thing I was going to talk about was in Yourba, which is my paternal ancestry, even the idea of the Yoruba as this ancient tribe, which is something that I had believed is like a colonial invention. There wasn't a sense of it being like a rigidly bounded tribal identity. It was actually, people understood their belonging in a way that was far more contingent on context, and was far more porous and far more malleable. And it was the kind of introduction of the British colonial administration and having to categorize people and to create a census and to kind of put this kind of like colonial logic and order onto these societies so they could be properly administrated, that introduced this idea of these like fixed identities that are bounded and that are actually exclusive, and that create these kind of identities of like insider and outsider rather than things that are more contingent. And actually the name that people who are now called Yoruba often used historically, I've just put it away, I have to read it in Yoruba, but in English it was the children of Oduduwa, or who's a deity. He's a deified ancestor and a deity. He's one of the deities in Yoruba cosmology. Or people who, the people who greet each other. The Yoruba language is full of salutations, like they're the greeting for like each time of the day, like whatever activity you're doing. You don't just say hi, there's like a specific greeting for that. So it's like the people who greet each other, this specific phrase, good morning. So it's not like a racial or tribal identity, it's something that is very different. So I think these very interesting possibilities for imagining belonging exist outside of in the English language. So for me personally, it's probably like exploring them, those ideas in those languages further. So I've got a lot of language learning to do. Yeah. I tried to learn Yoruba in my degree. The first year I was studying Yoruba, and then I gave up. But I think that in order, I actually can speak quite a bit of Japanese, and that was just from living in Japan and just being immersed in it. I kind of forgot most of it. But I feel like, with Irish, it's going to the Gaeilge. For Yoruba rather, it's like immersing myself in the language being spoken somewhere. So yeah. If anyone else has any suggestions on that, I would be really keen to hear ideas. But yeah, any other questions as well? Okay, I'll take the raised hand.
Yeah, I'm curious. Sorry, I didn't hear. Jim, sorry, no, please go.
So mine's left field, and I know it's not unfair, but I was really interested in ethnography of the family and your grandfather's experience at Trinity, dealing as a community at Trinity and the Royal College of Surgeons. And it sparked, for me, that moment sparks thinking about Christine Buckley, who has a different experience. But the line that I found really thought-provoking was the idea that your family, that family, your grandfather and your father's siblings who were born in Ireland were not a threat because they were going home. They weren't seen as immigrants, and therefore there wasn't a challenge. But the mixed race Irish community who were born in Ireland at that time experienced institutionalization. They were hidden away and sent as far away from Dublin, especially to Clifton, which can't get further away. A significant community of mixed race Irish children were raised by Sisters of Mercy in that institution. And I'm thinking about the mix and what role that religion plays. So then I jump forward to 2021 and that moment, that post-2021 moment, because where you identified that the term Duine Gorm was rejected by young Irish, new Irish. But 2021 was also the publication of the Baby Hunger Code came from the Irish state, where once again, in the contemporary moment, race was elided as a category of abuse, and that mixed race community, I think of Conrad Byrne and Byron and Rosemary Dasser, you still are fighting and present to have acknowledged state practices. I don't know if there's a question, sorry. But maybe it's the parallelism, it's the both and, the two things happening and continuing to happen. I mean, I love your project and I love where it ended up, but I'm also thinking about members of the mixed race community in Ireland and in the Irish diaspora, especially in England, who are still fighting fighting for acknowledgement and for justice, and to be recognised even as the state is important to provide justice to other survivors of institutional abuse, race is still today the category that's alive in our race.
I know all of the people that you mentioned. I know I actually grew up with Christine Buckley's sons. They were like good friends of mine when I was a teenager. Ireland is so small. But yeah, I mean, I actually came across this reference to the coloured children in the industrial schools in the Ryan report, and it was actually the first time that I'd seen any historical documentation or reference of kind of Black Irish people, like mixed race Irish people, and it was so shocking. It actually made my experiences in school, and also I quote it in Don't Touch My Hair, and my leaving Ireland as soon as I finished school, it really put that into context, because it spoke about the coloured boys and girls, but it was like the coloured they were children in industrial schools, and it said that these unfortunate, I think I remember it verbatim because it was just like it's kind of seared into my consciousness, but it was like these unfortunate children, but it was like the girls in particular are like hot-tempered and difficult to control. And then it was saying the boys tended to be like popular with like the priests and the other boys, and they were like good at sports or something. And I was quite interested in the gender difference, but it was like the girls were hot-headed and difficult to control. And then it was like our recommendation for them is that when they finish the school, when they get out of the schools, that they leave Ireland, because their chances of marriage here are nil. And obviously that's the thing that determines one value in future. But it was like, yeah, they're not well received by white people or black people. So the advice is that they leave Ireland and they go to a multicultural city in the UK, because that's the only place that there might be some chance of anything. And I was like, oh, that's literally literally what I did. And that's literally how I was categorized in school, as being like hot-headed and difficult to control. So I found reading it really shocking, but also I was just like, wow, that really maps onto an experience that I had. And I'm not adopted. I wasn't in the industrial school, so I don't have to deal with all of the trauma of that. But thank you for adding that.
A couple of quick comments and then a question. I was intrigued by the fascination that you had with folklore and mythology, because it echoes, of course, one of the great icons of the generation just before you fill in it, of course, right? Because
I'm writing about him at the moment.
He's incredible, isn't he? And the fact that he was completely absorbed by mythology and folklore, and would often be asked in the street as a little kid, the mother would recall of, where did you adopt this kid, kind of thing, those kind of questions. And he was as Irish could be, and what that meant to him. So, and of course, the how he came back into vogue later and becomes now an icon. Okay. The other quick point is also in the potential of reimagining Duine Gorm, which is interesting, because it was an imaginary category, right? It existed in a language at a time where people had few real historical examples to look at. They imagined black people as blue people, rhetorically, and it's interesting. And also the color blue is interesting. You went to the sea, which echoes a lot of Colleen's work. I'm waiting to hear where Colleen will come with that, because Colleen works on blue humanity. So Colleen is the expert on this.
I'm so excited.
Not the expert, definitely not.
But the notion that, by the way, we also often think of the colour of Ireland, the national colour, as green, which is misleading historically, because actually the national colour of Ireland, people don't want to hear that, is blue.
No way, I didn't know that.
Yeah, St. Patrick's colour is blue. And people forget that historically, if you go back to Middle Ages, that's interesting. So just that there's potentials there. No, but the question I was going to ask you, there is a question, it's not just comments. It's about Americanization. And Americanization is a misleading word, because I know that Victor is here. And by the way, this conversation will continue tomorrow at Connolly House. We'll have a whole panel engaging with questions of race in Ireland. So I encourage people to continue tomorrow with the discussion. But I know people say America and they think America's USA, and Victor can argue that, right, there's other Americas that come from Brazil. But in North America, how much the discourse on race in USA, American USA, the Atlanta that you experienced before, how enabling it was for a long time, how much it was a category which influenced debates definitely in the 60s in Ireland, in the 70s, right, race discussions here, and the way it was adopted in the question of the North and other places in Northern Ireland. And then you describe how 2020 seemed to many people to be an enabling moment of putting it on the table, but you identified problems that were evident there. But for many people, it was also seen as enabling, and you look at what happens what happened in, with all the immigrants in Ireland and the change and people adopting these categories, which were in many ways adopted from American popular culture and were enabling, because it comes with all this coolness, it comes with, like, with hip hop and other things, so it's an enabling category. But, and this is the question, now, as we arrive now, where it's being completely, American rhetoric has turned on its head in the last year in terms of race, and how that comes into your thinking about it, with the war on DEI, with the war on racial categories in general. And so America is no longer a model. America, if anything, is a bad model. If anything, is nothing not to look at, but to be ashamed of looking at as a model. How does that affect people like yourselves looking at, where are you reaching for now to find discourse? Is it going to be completely self-generated now in Ireland? Is it going to be other cases?
I think one of my biggest inspirations is the Black radical tradition, and that is very different to kind of liberal anti-racism. So I wrote What White People Can Do Next, from allyship to coalition, because I saw the concept of allyship as emblematic of liberal anti-racism, and I saw coalition as emblematic of the Black radical tradition. And I actually think that is a far more generative framework for creating not just an anti-racist world, but actually like a liberatory world that sees the interconnectedness of all forms of oppression, not just solely focusing on racism, but actually sees how the economic system that we live under kind of generates various crises and forms of oppression. So I wrote that book to actually try and like connect the conversation that was happening, or to just kind of like introduce some of those ideas associated with the Black radical tradition, which is American in its origin, it's kind of has its origins in people like W.E.B. Du Bois, the more socialist iteration of him, not the talented 10th, kind of more Harlem Renaissance version of Du Bois. So I think still, actually in many ways, like I'm inspired by American, Black American theorization. I was never particularly like inspired by the DEI privilege liberal anti-racism framework anyway. So yeah, I don't know if that answers, but it's not what I was drawing on. I was actually trying to provide people with an alternative framework that I think has more power. And a lot of those people, even like the Black Panthers at the Combahee River Collective, those kind of activists in like the late 60s, 70s, and into the early 80s, they are thinking about like parallel institutions. So rather than like trying to be included in a system and institutions that they find corrupt, they're actually trying to create parallel institutions.
One last question.
Well, this kind of follows from that. It's just all really interesting. It's giving me so much to think about. But I was wondering if you could expand on, you said it a couple times, this idea that like Irish and Black has more similarities than oppression, right? And kind of pulling out and teasing out what that means. And you mentioned like song, folklore, and music and all of this. And I think it kind of flows from what Guy is asking. I was wondering if you could just expand on that and tell us a bit about what you think, especially as scholars, how we can kind of make those connections and bring it into our work and our teaching and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So gosh, there's loads of directions I can go with that. In terms of scholarship, when I was teaching at Villanova, I did a course I designed a course that was looking at the relationship between the Irish literary revival and the Harlem Renaissance. And there was actually quite a lot of exchange between the architects of, I guess, like the Harlem Renaissance and not exchange with the Irish literary revival, but they were inspired by things that happened in the Irish literary revival. For instance, like Elaine Locke, who's kind of seen as like, I guess, the architect of the Harlem Renaissance. He says Harlem should be to the, using the historical terminology, I'm not going to say it. Harlem should be to Black people what Dublin is to the Irish in terms of like all of the playwrights and poets and writers that were coming out of Ireland at that time. And one of the things that they were really interested in was the use in the Irish literary revival, people like J.M. Singh, the use of kind of like vernacular Irish in literature. And so there were all these contestations around like, I guess like Black American English, and this kind of idea that it could be used in works of like literary merit, and that was something that should be explored. So you have people like Claude McKay writing books in kind of, even though he's Jamaican, but he was very involved in the Harlem Renaissance. So yeah, writing styles in terms of like using vernacular and kind of like elevating language is actually like very poetic and influential to the status that it deserves to be, rather than like seen as kind of like broken English or like pidgin or some sort of like kind of like having some sort of inferior status. Claude McKay is really interesting for his relationship to Ireland. He saw a strong parallel between Jamaica and Ireland, and then he came to the UK. I think he met George Bernard Shaw and had some really racist exchange with him, and was really disappointed. But I think like outside of that, he has written very interestingly about the similarities between Jamaica and Ireland. I can't remember the writings off the top of my head, but it's something I can easily share with you. I see strong parallels between Jamaica and Ireland specifically as well. In terms of many things, one of the things I see is like can identify as very similar is this contrast between a culture that is on one hand like very actually like conservative, is very conservative, and then on the other hand has this very like anarchic and kind of like unruly like strand running through it as well. In terms of humour, I see parallels between Ireland and Jamaica. In terms of expectations from a social gathering, I see parallels between Ireland and Jamaica. Yeah, there's I think there's lots of things.
Well, speaking of social gatherings, I think you've earned your glass of wine, but several more after that. Please join me in thanking.
For those who don't know, the way to Connolly House will be walking together kind of in that direction, so you can follow me if those are people who don't know.